Hey, podcast listeners. This podcast is brought to you by Pineview Insurance Group. When I sold my company, I wasn't really sure what I should be doing. I started buying a rental property. I started buying a car, and I didn't really know what I needed to do from an insurance standpoint. But that stuff is very, very important. Me and a lot of my founder friends, after selling a business, we have no idea what we should be doing insurance-wise, and that's where Pineview Insurance Group comes in. So after selling his insurance company for $435 million, Mike Lloyd started this new company. I highly recommend it. It really does an audit on your assets and tells you what you should be investing in terms of insurance. So this is everything from your auto, your home, your umbrella policy, and much, much more. So if you guys are curious about working with an insurance group that's geared towards entrepreneurs, I recommend Pineview. You can get access to Pineview's new member waitlist at pvig.com/made-it. Again, that's pvig.com/made-it. Cheers, guys.
Welcome to Made It with Connor Tompkins.
Hey, everyone. I'm here with Chip Conley. He started one of the largest boutique hotel companies in the United States before selling it. He spent 7.5 years as the modern elder of Airbnb, and maybe we can jump into what that means as far as helping these young founders take the company essentially public and taking it through an IPO and making it the most valuable hospitality company in the world. He started over the past 7 years, the Modern Elder Academy. And so you guys can check out his TED Talk after this video, talking about how we can make every year, the way I think about it is every year better than the previous year. It doesn't have to be a midlife crisis. It can be something more aspirational and more wholesome. So guys, I'm excited to introduce Chip to the podcast. This is a great podcast interview for those that are post-exit and trying to figure out what happens next. But we're probably going to get all different types of different nuggets. So Chip, good to have you on the podcast.
Well, first of all, Connor, it's great to be here. I am old enough now to have seen enough patterns in my own life to have the wisdom of pattern recognition. And so, I appreciate the fact that I can share some of that wisdom. And I'm constantly learning as much from younger people as they are from me. So that's just how it works these days.
I think it would be fantastic. You're stepping into a couple different trends. So one is there's a lot of people that are selling their business that are trying to figure out what happens next. And there's also a lot of people that want to figure out it shouldn't be a midlife crisis. Like every year could be better, right? We know ourselves better. We're more secure. We know who our friends and family can be closer to us than ever before, but we have to be almost more intentional about that. But before we get into that, I want to learn a little bit about how you started so many different boutique hotels. There's over 30 that you helped start, right?
52 of them. Yeah.
There's 52 hotels. How did that happen?
So I went to Stanford undergrad and then went straight into Stanford Business School. This is a long time ago. So I entered business school at age 21, which was unusual, and was really fixated on commercial real estate. That's what I wanted to do. Be a developer probably. And when I graduated from business school, I went to work for a maverick real estate developer in San Francisco. And spent almost 3 years there. And while I was there, I learned a lot about how to develop things in San Francisco. During my time there, I was very curious about the boutique hotel trend, which was just getting off the ground in the U.S., mostly just in San Francisco and New York at that point. And so I went to the head of the company and I said, I want to start a division of the company that specializes in creating boutique hotels. And he laughed at me and said, like, dude, you're like 25 years old and we don't want to be in the hotel business. So there's like two things against you. And so I decided to leave the company and start my own company called Joie de Vivre, means joy of life in French. That was when I was 26. And my first purchase was a broken down pay by the hour motel in the Tenderloin of San Francisco.
Wow.
And I renamed it the Phoenix. It became a pretty famous rock and roll hotel. Over the course of the 24 years that I ran Joie de Vivre as the CEO, we grew to 3,500 employees and 52 hotels and 25 restaurants and 6 spas. And so, we were a sizable company. But in my late 40s, I really struggled with running the company. I had the skill set to do it, but we had been through the dot-com bust in 9/11 in the early part of this millennia, and then also then the Great Recession. And I was writing books at that point, giving speeches, and I was really enjoying that part of my life. I was not enjoying being the CEO of the company anymore. And yet we were going through an existential crisis as a company. due to the Great Recession. So in my late 40s, a lot of stuff went wrong in my life. And I had including having an NDE, a near-death experience, where I had an allergic reaction to an antibiotic and died 9 times over 90 minutes.
You died 9 times. How did you were in shock and
It was after giving a speech on the stage in St. Louis. I was signing books. Thankfully, I was sitting down. I went unconscious first. So I didn't die yet. They put me on the ground. When the paramedics showed up, they put me on a gurney, and that's when they had heart monitors on me, and they realized that I was going flatline. And so they brought the, electric paddles out and, would bring me back to life and took me on the ambulance and was in the emergency room and then the ICU. And so it was quite an experience to go. And I went to the other side. So I had all of that kind of the near-death experience kind of thing. And so at 47, it was like a hotelier's wake-up call.
Yes.
Do I really want to live my life this way? And when I say this way, I don't mean like dying, but just the way the prior couple of years have been really, really rough. And I realized the thing I thought I'd want to do the rest of my life, I didn't want to do the rest of my life. That was really hard to come to that recognition and that realization. And then to also feel like, oh my God, I have created handcuffs for myself. There's no way I can get out of this company. I didn't set it up in any way for it to be sort of rolled up into me liquidating it, especially at the bottom of the Great Recession.
Was it one of those things where the company couldn't run without you because you were so ingrained, or?
So think of me as like, my first book that I wrote was called The Rebel Rules, and the subtitle was called, was Daring to Be Yourself in Business. The guy who wrote the foreword for the book was Richard Branson. So over and over again, I was sort of compared to him. He became a friend, and people would say, well, you're like a small version of Richard Branson. What Richard Branson is the version, you are to Joie de Vivre. So based upon what I just told you, the idea of me extricating myself and no longer being the face of the company, nor sort of the visionary, nor in my case, operating the company, was really hard to do. But it's also, there's a lot of ego attached to that too. So let's just be really clear. I had an identity that was, my business card was my identity.
This happens all the time with like post-exit founders. You're like, I am this company. And then when people ask you, what do you do? It's like, where do you start? But for now, you have a bunch
This is why I teach workshops now for entrepreneurs who are thinking about selling their company or selling their company or exit. But long story short is I didn't have a workshop to go to. I didn't have a resource other than my best friend who was a life coach, and she was really helpful for me. And over the next 2 years, I figured out how to extricate myself from the company, sell the business at the bottom of the market for a lot less than it was worth, but also feel like, okay, I'm doing this because it's good for my health and my sanity. And I also lost 5 male friends to suicide during that same time, ages 42 to 52, 3 of them entrepreneurs and the entrepreneurs had just really, all 3 of them had lost their businesses to the Great Recession. So, I was going through a time in my own life where I was really, what you might call the dark night of the ego, a dark night of the soul. I now call it the dark night of the ego, because in many ways my ego needed to go through a bit of the death of like saying, I am no longer this identity of the founder and CEO of Joie de Vivre, because I'm moving on from that with the scariness of what's next. So that happened, and at age 50, I was all of a sudden had the freedom to figure out what I wanted to do, and spent the next 2 years doing what I call a midlife atrium, which is create the space and light and air to sort of see what emerges in my life and give myself the curiosity that I didn't have when I was on the treadmill, the curiosity to try things and to explore some things. And I had been really interested in a few topics. And so there are 3 particular topics during that era from 50 to 52 that I explored. And one of them turned into a business. But at age 52, I got a call from Brian Chesky, the young founder of Airbnb, who with his 2 co-founders had read one of my books called Peak, How Great Companies Get Their Mojo from Maslow. And he said he wanted this little tiny tech startup, Airbnb, to be a peak company someday. And he'd like to have it become the world's most valuable hospitality company. And I laughed at him and I said, like, you know what? that's a terrible idea for a business. So like, who's ever going to stay in each other's homes? It doesn't make any sense. And
Yeah.
he came over and spent 4 hours with me in the afternoon. This was 12 years ago, and showed me their numbers, saying like, you know what, we're growing quickly, and there's something to this. And but it's really right now only appealing to millennials on a budget in major urban markets, and we want to go mainstream, and we want you to help us go mainstream. And so that's why I spent the next 7.5 years as the modern elder. That's what they called me, which I didn't like at first because, like, are you making fun of my age? But I was twice the age. I was 52. Average age in the company was 26. And they said, Chip, a modern elder is someone who's as curious as they are wise. So it wasn't about me just dispensing wisdom. It was also me learning, because I never worked in the tech company before.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was the mentor to the 3 founders of Airbnb. And ultimately, yeah, we took the company and made it into the most valuable hospitality company in the world.
That's pretty special. Whenever I hear about the modern elder, I think about and NASA and the space program, they have what they call graybeards, who were the people that were involved in the Apollo missions. And for a lot of things in space, you're talking about 10 or 20-year cycles. And these are the people that had actually built a rocket or had actually built the moon lander and understood what was involved in that. And in some ways, these are the most valuable people for our space odyssey or whatever comes next, as far as like landing on the moon again, landing on Mars. Is you're finding the people that have been there and done that have the wisdom and the know-how to be able to piece that program together.
In the past, we could rely upon wisdom alone to maybe be valuable. Today, it's that curiosity and the wisdom, because I needed to learn as much from the young people in that company around DQ, digital intelligence, as they could learn from me about EQ, emotional intelligence. And so we were both better off for it. And I do think that the wisdom becomes that much more valuable in the era of knowledge, the proliferation of knowledge. All the world's knowledge is on this little iPhone in my pocket.
Yeah, you're talking to ChatGPT
and everything. I mean, like, knowledge is a commodity today. So the scarcity is really wisdom. And so one of the things that I've been spending the last few years doing, based upon my experience at Airbnb, but now with creating the Modern Elder Academy, also known as MEA, is to look at how do we create wisdom management practices and tools that help people to piece together an ability to make sense of our life lessons and turn those painful life lessons into the raw material for future wisdom, both individually, personally, and professionally, but also collectively on teams and in the company. And so that's what I do for a living today, because I started 7 years ago, the Modern Elder Academy, the world's first midlife wisdom school.
One thing I appreciate is that you were able to take a couple years to take a break and let the right thing come to you. I'm not sure if you would have that experience and Airbnb come to you and you step into the role that you did for those 2 founders if you didn't take that space. Do you feel like that was a big part of it, is being able to hit pause?
Yeah. Well, let's start by saying that if I had not sold Joie de Vivre, the founders, the other three founders, would never have approached me, because they was like, well, like I Chip, maybe
You're busy, he's doing something.
Yeah, he can be a mentor to us, but he's full-time CEO of this company. So sometimes you have to create space and see what emerges. And I think talented people sometimes have to put themselves on a sabbatical or a hiatus and say during that time, I'm not going to take on anything new. I'm going to have some curiosity about how serendipity has her way with me, and let serendipity show up with whatever's going to happen next. So that you have to do. Number 2 is I was curious. I had put myself into a place where there were a bunch of things I was curious about. I wanted to learn more about festivals. I was the first board member of Burning Man, founding board member of the Burning Man board. And so I was interested in festivals. I was interested in hot springs. I was interested in emotions. So I ended up writing a book on emotions. I ended up starting a festival website. So I did a bunch of things that actually gave me some opportunity to take my curiosity and make it practically interesting in the world. But the fact is, it also gave me the openness to exploring something with Airbnb. When that came knocking, it initially came knocking, and I agreed to 15 hours a week of mentorship to the founders. And within a month, that was 15 hours a day. So I ultimately, I had to clear my plate and say like, okay, I am full time doing this now. And that took some persuasion, in my life where, I had to really say no to a bunch of things and, get off a bunch of boards and things like that. But it was worth it. I mean, thank God I didn't turn down that opportunity. And Airbnb was going to succeed without me. Let's be clear. With me, it succeeded more than it would without me. And I think on so many different levels, I was able to offer something there that helped us to have training wheels on the business,
Yeah.
understand how do we learn from our mistakes as quickly as possible and make sure we also are really focused. The company had 30 strategic initiatives when I joined. Nobody, including Brian as the CEO, could even, list all of them. And
How do you keep track of that? That's just too much.
Within 4 months, we had gotten it down to 4, and we had 4 strategic initiatives.
Do you remember what the 4 were?
We changed them, or we looked at them annually, and we sometimes evolved one in, one out. I could try to come up with the 4 right now, but I'm not even going to try because I don't want to get it wrong. But I do know, I know what some of them were. Some of them were infrastructure based. Some of them were marketing based. For example, one of them related to exploring vacation rentals. So Airbnb was only, 50% of our business was in the 20 biggest cities in the world. That was it. So half our business was purely in 20 cities. And so one of our opportunities was to say like, hey, there's this thing called VRBO, which at that point was purely just a marketing website, and where people would just put their listing up and pay an annual fee to VRBO, and it was in no way a marketplace. And so we said like, God, there's all these people with rental homes, in Lake Tahoe or in Myrtle Beach or wherever, and how do we get into that business? And it took a cultural shift in the company for us to agree to go into that business, because in many ways the bread and butter of Airbnb was having people stay in someone's home, their primary home, often when the host was there. But that was one of the strategic initiatives was around the idea of exploring this huge TAM, this total addressable market that we, previous to me coming there, had said, no, that's not the ethos of our company. Our company is primary residences. And of course, as we moved more into either of those directions, as we got bigger and bigger, regulation became a big part of our dealings. We had to deal with regulation and taxes and a bunch of things that any legitimate company has to deal with. And part of my job there was to be this, Secretary of State to the hospitality industry and to regulators, to help them to see that Airbnb needs to be regulated. We're open to regulation that's sensible, and it needs to pay occupancy taxes. So, but when I joined, the idea that oh, yes, we're going to be like, we want to be regulated and taxed, is like, people said like, what are you talking about? And I said like, just look out 2 or 3 years. And with our growth, if we're not regulated or taxed, we may get shut down. And so that has been one of the biggest challenges for Airbnb from the start, is this, a cognitive dissonance around knowing that regulation and taxes are essential, but also knowing that regulating Airbnb like they do a hotel company doesn't make sense when some person for 20 days a year opens up their home when they're on vacation, to have someone stay in it. It's just like, you shouldn't have all the regulations of a hotel in that case. So
in many ways, you're helping the industry mature, right? Because if you are taxed, then that means you are accepted, right?
Yeah.
And that's huge for cryptocurrency right now.
There's a lot of similarities. Legitimacy comes from regulation. And for a lot of people in the early stage of, the pioneering stage, that's hard for them to fathom. But part of what a modern elder does, a young brain, Arthur Brooks wrote about this in From Strength to Strength, a young brain is fast and focused, fluid intelligence. And you tend to focus on what's in front of you and you get it done and you move to the next thing. And whereas a crystallized intelligence is something you get better at as you get older. And it means you can think more systemically, holistically, and connect the dots. And so to be able to be in a meeting and say, let's not focus on the next 3 months, let's focus on where we are 3 years from now. And based upon where we think we're going to be, what is the landscape that we're going to be faced when it comes to affordable housing, and you name it. There are a bunch of other things, and I had to help people to see, like, we need to assume we're going to be a much larger company then, and prepare for that in so many different ways. And that helped that I had the experience and the ability to sort of think futuristically about it. And that's probably the reason Brian made me the head of strategy for the company, beyond just being head of global hospitality and being the in-house mentor to the founders.
Chip, one of the things that you bring up a lot is curiosity, right? And that being like one of the main drivers. I think for a lot of younger entrepreneurs that are probably listening to this, it's building something that you can point to and say, oh, look at this, I built this thing. And then it's also monetary, like I'm building this thing to generate wealth for me and my family. But once you cross that bridge, there needs to be something that replaces it. And for the most healthy entrepreneurs that I normally see, that's curiosity, right? Because it's inexhaustible. You can always be curious. It's exciting. It's new. What are some ways that you exercise curiosity personally? And then what are some ways that you recommend as like an exercise to modern elders so they can execute on curiosity?
We all have that capacity to be curious. We showed it when we were 4 years old. And then it sort of got bred out of us by the school system and often our parents. Our parents were tired of being asked, why is the sky blue? It's like, you don't know the answer to it, so you want your kid to stop asking the question. You don't want to feel stupid. And so in some ways, by the time you're 15, you're asking, 1/10 the number of questions you were asking at age 5.
Yeah.
It's more important to not ask questions, but to have the answers. There are a lot of ways to stoke the curiosity. First of all, you need to understand, do you have the habitat and the calendar to allow it? Curiosity is not an efficient way of being and thinking. It requires a certain amount of what if and why, and answers like about what if and why usually take a while. They're not a yes, no. So you got to start with that. And that's why being curious when you're running a company can sometimes be hard, unless you say, we're doing an offsite retreat. We're going to spend 2 days being curious, and there's going to be no distractions, and let's do that. So you have to make the space for it. That's number one. Number two is you have to sort of you have to learn about something called appreciative inquiry. Appreciative inquiry is a way of asking questions that moves away from yes, no answers and moves toward the idea of potential. Like instead of looking for like being the critical, what if you said like, well, what is this going to look like 5 years from now? And how do we work backwards from that to build toward that? So you sort of look at something with potential, and you build questions that help sort of build the infrastructure for that potential. Another thing that's really critical when it comes to curiosity is to not shut people down in a meeting or in a culture that allows people to say, hey, stay with me here for a moment. I want to flesh this out. Don't shut me down. And that's one that I've had to learn over time.
I think it's common with a lot of CEOs or visionaries and entrepreneur operating system language is that like you feel like you have to provide the answer. You feel like you should be the one talking in meetings, and oftentimes you need to leave space in the room.
Well, and this is why I have a co-founder of MEA named Jeff, who's just a big thinker. He's the best facilitator I've ever met, and he's just a really visionary kind of thinker. And there are times where we're having an efficient meeting, and Jeff will go and ask the big question, and we don't have time for it. And so I have learned to not shut Jeff down, but to maybe redirect his energies and say like, gosh, Jeff, that's a great question. I don't know if we have time for it now in this half-hour meeting. Let's actually come back to that. Let's have that conversation, but let's save it for a time when we have time for it, rather than sort of saying, Jeff, that's a stupid question. Like, we're focused on this other thing right now, because that will shut him down, and shutting him down is actually not good for the company. So I've learned my lesson there. I also sometimes if you have a big thinker, I'm a creative thinker, I'm a visionary, and when there's someone else who's as good or better than you in that skill, and they're constantly popping off with all their ideas, your ego can get involved. And so that's another thing an entrepreneur or a CEO needs to be very careful of, is making sure that you're not putting a damper on someone who has a huge talent in an area that you have as well, but they may actually be, showing you up.
I want to go almost backwards because when a lot of people hear this, they're trying to connect the dots between where they are and where you are, that path that you took, right? And there was a pretty big leap, a pretty big key moment when you split off from your job and you bought that boutique hotel, you bought the Phoenix, right? Can you tell me about how you did that? Is that something that how were you able to put together the financing? How were you able to take that leap?
First of all, when you're 25 or 26 years old, you have nothing to lose.
That's 100% true. Well, actually, there's a little bit of something, but it's not like you have a family to like support and carry forward, right?
Yeah, I didn't have some of the things you'd have 10 or 20 years later. So, yeah, I could lose a reputation, etc. But I will tell you that at that time I had been in a year-long screenwriting course. I had been learning massage therapy. So the truth was, some of my passion was showing up in other places.
Okay.
To be 25 years old and having gone to Stanford Business School and to see my passion going outside of business to massage therapy or to screenwriting, it was suggesting that I was not on a path that was satisfying a sense of purpose and passion. And so knowing that boutique hotels were very creative, it felt like a wave that was about to happen, because boutique hotels were virtually nothing in the US at that point, was interesting to me. It was a time where I could really explore it. So what I went through the proper channel in the company. They shut me down. And then I said, okay, I'm going to, on my own, start looking for hotels. And I found this, broken down, bankrupt motel in a terrible location, but it had a great inner courtyard. And I know how to throw a good party. And I could look at this and say like, oh my God, 44 rooms surrounding a swimming pool and an amazing restaurant and bar. I was like, hey, this place is amazing. And so I explored it and found that it was on a 40-year lease. So I couldn't buy the land. What I could do is I could buy the lease and have 40 years left, which, by the way, the 40 years is up as of this September. So I've owned this for 40 years. I'm in my mid 60s now.
Yeah.
And so I could buy it for $800,000. And so I bought this place. I went out and raised money, raised $1.1 million from people I went to college with, business school with, friends of my family, etc. And spent $800,000 of that buying the lease, $200,000 of it renovating the place, which doesn't go very far, and then $100,000 in working capital. And that's really how I started my hotel company against all odds. And because I knew that I wanted to go after musicians and creative types and filmmakers, etc., I had a very clear idea of what I wanted the Phoenix, that's the name of the property, to be. And it became pretty successful pretty quickly. I was lucky because I didn't know a fucking thing about hotels. Yeah, but it was a great experience.
It's like lucky and ignorance, but it's like, and also hard work, right? But hopefully those line up. And usually we hear about like the success stories. We don't always hear about the ones that didn't really work out. So there's a little bit of a success bias there.
Yeah.
What were the unit economics behind something like this? How much was a hotel like the Phoenix able to bring in? How were your costs associated with this?
This is a great story, Connor. The very first night, we closed escrow December 31st, 1986. And
you remember when?
I do, because it was New Year's Eve. And so the very first night we had 40 of our 40 rooms full. And again, people would pay by the hour. Some people would pay by the hour of this place. I mean, and they had porn in the place. I mean, it was sort of a sleazy place.
Yeah.
So that first night I was like, wow, we did our 90% occupancy on our first night.
Yeah, we did.
But it was New Year's Eve. The next night we had like 3 rooms full. I was like, oh fuck, what am I going to do? And so long story short is I really learned something quickly. The economics were, in order to break even, since we didn't have any debt, we just needed to get like 50 to 60% occupancy and keep our costs low. And so, the good news is in San Francisco, it's a strong hotel market. Not right now, for sure. It's been really weak the last 4 years there, but it's historically been a strong market. So we just needed to figure out how to get our occupancy. The average in town was about 72, 75%, and we just needed to be 50 to 60%. So, I looked at how do we rise with the tide of San Francisco and make this property fill up when the rest of the city's filling up too. Our margins were good because our costs were low and we had very little debt. So, we were able to get there. The key thing ultimately was how do you get the bands on the road to stay with us? And that became a really, really big part of my next 2 years, is how do you package the Phoenix as the coolest rock and roll hotel in the United States?
Or how did you pull that off? I just watched Almost Famous, so I'm almost an expert in this.
There were a lot of things. So each hotel room was dedicated to a different artist. So the art in the hotel was all local, young artists, and we would throw art shows by the pool. And the restaurant became Miss Pearl's Jam House, which was this cool Jamaican restaurant. And I spent none of the money to build that out. I got a very well-known restaurateur in town, Julie Ring, to do that. And the number one thing that attracted the bands was we had one of our 44 rooms as a massage studio, and we offered free massages to tour managers.
That is genius. And I know exactly where to go.
So the basic premise was offer tour managers something that no other hotel was providing, what I call an unrecognized need that a tour manager has, and then assume that and persuade them to tell their friends. And the other thing we had going for us there was we had free bus parking. And if you're a tour bus on the road, and you have, in many cases, it's the driver who really likes to have his bus, right next to the hotel and motel, that helped as well. So yeah, we were, I guess against all odds, that little, motel in the Tenderloin became sort of famous, and lots of celebrities started staying there.
I think you found something where a lot of people jump straight to, I'm going to talk to the front man, or I'm going to talk to the CEO. And you're like, I'm going to make a perk that's good for the bus driver. I'll make a perk that's good for the manager. There's other people that are key stakeholders here that are not always the first person that may come to mind, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's part of the reason why sometimes companies will send, a bouquet of flowers to the executive assistant for a decision maker, because they know that EA has a huge influence on that decision maker's, life. And they want that EA to be very positive about the salesperson who's coming in and to sell them on something, sell the boss on something. So yeah, for me, one of the things I learned when I was at Airbnb was Brian lived a life, and he's talked a lot about this since then. He's a workaholic, and he works extremely long hours, and he has not historically had much of a social life outside of that. And so he burns people out. And especially it's hard for people who have families or are in relationships and have families. And so one of the things I said to Brian in the first Thanksgiving that I was working in the company is, I want you to send a Thanksgiving gift to each of the spouses or partners of the executive leadership team.
Because, that's huge.
Because those folks have dealt with the fact that sometimes on a Friday at 8:00 at night, you say, I want the executive team in the office in half an hour, on a moment's notice, because, Airbnb was a fire drill all the time. And you can imagine, just based upon the nature of our business and how fast we were growing and how many municipalities could shut us down based upon laws. I mean, it was a 100-hour-a-week kind of job. So the idea of Brian saying thank you to the spouses was really helpful, because it actually showed that he cared and knew that they were having to sacrifice. So, these are the kinds of things that we need to be careful of, is you can sort of miss the peripheral vision of who's important.
I want to move into, you call it the midlife, right? Like this stage, and you wrote this book, and you're talking about learning to love this midlife element, and you're talking about 12 reasons why life gets better with age. Do you want to pull out a few reasons why you think life gets better?
Yeah. I mean, it was partly because we've had 6,000 people, average age 54, go through our program. But one out of every 5 people who come to MEA is a millennial. So I believe that midlife lasts from 35 to 75. It's a very long period of one's life. And yet, for a lot of us, we think of midlife as a crisis, not a chrysalis. The midlife for the butterfly, from the caterpillar to butterfly journey, is the chrysalis. And it's dark and gooey, but it's also where the transformation happens. And there's all kinds of research that shows the U curve of happiness, that the low point of happiness for adults is around age 45 to 50. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So what I really wanted to do in writing this book, Learning to Love Midlife, was I wanted to try to actually elevate some of the upside of aging as opposed to just focusing on the downside. We're all very clear on the downside of aging, but the upside of aging is less clear. And the upside of aging was really interesting to me. And so let me use 3 or 4 examples of the 12. There's 12 different chapters with 12 different reasons why life gets better with age. So emotional intelligence grows with age. That's not irrefutable, but it's pretty clear in terms of the research. Now, again, these are averages, so not everybody's emotional intelligence grows with age.
In some cases, it goes down.
Oh, for sure. We know people like that. So I want to make sure everybody knows these are averages. But why does emotional intelligence grow with age? Partly because you learn to moderate your emotions. You actually learn to be less reactive. You learn to be able to see the big picture on things. You start getting clear on like what's important in life. Don't sweat the small stuff. So for all these reasons, like the emotional intelligence grows with age. Another thing that grows with age is our ability to value social relationships. In our 20s, 30s, and 40s, we are so busy, and especially men, so busy that we let our friendship muscle atrophy. So it's in our 50s and 60s when we have that opportunity to potentially start to build those friendships again. And for those who don't, loneliness becomes the natural next step.
Yeah.
But social relationships, being really good at valuing social relationships, is something that we get better at as we get older. Partly because we realize that it's experiences and people, not things, that make us happy in the long run.
Why do you think it specifically happens to men?
Happens to men for a few reasons. Number one is we live in a culture in which boys are bred to be independent, John Wayne, rugged individualist, and maybe not be as open to expressing vulnerabilities with their friends as girls are. And therefore, when you have vulnerabilities as you get older, number one is you don't have the capacity or the experience of talking about it. Secondly, you feel alone because your friends aren't talking about it, even though your friends are going through some of the same stuff you're going through. You end up in this quiet desperation. And it's part of the reason why, the male suicide rate is 4 to 5 times what the female suicide rate is. And and having lost 5 male friends to suicide in a 2.5-year period, I'm very cognizant of this one. So social relations for women, they keep that muscle, even as busy as they are. Women are actually better at juggling, their schedule. They're multitaskers better than men. There's lots of evidence of that. And so the multitasking of friendships and in integrating friendships, especially when you're going through hard times, is something that women are better at. It doesn't mean that men can't get good at this. It just means that culturally, socially, that's just sort of how we've been. What else gets better with age? Wisdom. Wisdom, there's some correlation with age and wisdom, but not a lot. So it doesn't mean just because you're older, you're wiser. Nope. Wisdom is the capacity to understand your life experiences, make sense of them, and take those lessons and turn it into something that's practically applicable in your life moving forward. And then you can share it with others. So something that, wisdom can grow with age. When I was 28 years old and I'd been running my boutique hotel company for 2 years, I decided to start this practice of writing in a wisdom book. I took a journal off my bookshelf that I'd not written in, and I wrote on the cover of it my wisdom book. And I started a practice where every weekend I spend 20 minutes, 30 minutes sometimes, writing bullet points of what I learned that week. Usually they were like life lessons, personal, professional lessons. I was cultivating and harvesting my life lessons in a way to make it valuable for me moving forward. Why do I bring this up? because it's a really simple practice. It takes you 20 to 30 minutes, on a Saturday or Sunday. That's it for the whole week. And I would do this every weekend. And so I've been doing this for 36 years. I now do it in Google Docs. I now have my leadership teams do this such that once a quarter, I don't require people to do what I do, which is every week I do it. But once a quarter, I sit down with my leadership team at Airbnb or at Joie de Vivre previously, or now at MEA. And we have an hour meeting where each of us says, what was our biggest lesson of the quarter? What did you learn? What was the lesson? What did you learn from it? And how's it going to serve you in the future? And then we also have the team talk about what our team lesson of the quarter was. So we get to vote on that. The value in this is, number one, is it requires vulnerability, it requires candor, it requires a growth mindset of saying, I am learning something. And I learn from my lessons, often from my mistakes. It allows the CEO to show some willingness to say, like, yeah, I'm constantly learning as well. And then when I hear a lesson of the COO about something they learned, their lesson becomes my lesson. If you just,
I love learning from other people's lessons.
Oh my God. I mean, like, your broken nose means I don't have to have a broken nose. I mean, again, figuratively speaking. And so a team, wow, what a bonding experience. I think it's one of the best things I brought to the table at Airbnb. So long story short is, that's an example of a wisdom management practice. We're familiar with knowledge management practices. Peter Drucker coined the term knowledge management and knowledge workers in 1959. But now it's all about, I think, wisdom workers and wisdom management. So wisdom is another thing that gets better with age. Our ability to edit gets better with age, to actually say, there's things I don't want to do anymore, and to focus on what is important. Our spiritual curiosity grows with age. The list is long. There are 12 of them. I've given you 5 just now. What I really wanted to do is help to elevate the idea of a pro-aging message, because there's a woman named, a professor at Yale named Becca Levy, who's a friend of MEA, and we're like a living laboratory for her research, where she's shown that when you shift your mindset on aging from a negative to a positive, you gain 7.5 years of additional life. Which is more life than if you actually stopped smoking or started exercising at age 50.
How do you test that?
Her research is really conclusive, because she has longitudinal studies from a group of people in Ohio that shows how they evaluated their relationship with aging over time.
Yeah.
And they showed the health of each person over time. So they were able to look at other variables, because, you have to be able to you look at this in a way where you dissected, all the other variables out, so that you're just looking at age perspective. And so peer reviewed, and, the research has been, repeated since the original study was put out there about 20 years ago. So really important, though, and not surprising, because actually, so part of what MEA does is help people to shift their mindset around their relationship with aging, and to help prolong their longevity.
If you have an optimistic mindset, you're probably working out more, you're probably meeting more with friends, you're probably eating healthier.
And it is optimistic, yes, and it's specific to aging. Because someone can be an optimist, but then also say, like, I hate aging. I hate it. And let's be clear, my body is not what it used to be, and I don't like that. I mean, I'm not trying to be Pollyanna here, but I am trying to say, like, you know what? If you think of your whole life as just the preservation of your body, and that's the only way you look at, have you grown in your life, then you're going to be sadly, disappointed that, your body does deteriorate over a course of a lifetime. But your heart, certain parts of your mind, your spirit, your relational ability to connect with others, these are things that actually can get better with age.
I want to talk about the Modern Elder Academy, and also the physical space that you actually made, because like inside Baja, the facility that you built looks beautiful. Like, it looks breathtaking. And
we have we have a campus in Baja on the beach, and then we have a campus in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where we have 2,600 acres of regenerative horse ranch land, and 17 horses. So I wanted to, as a hospitality guy, I wanted to create a retreat center. I also was on the board of the Esalen Institute, famous retreat center in Big Sur, California. for 10 years and used to teach there. So I had some experience with retreat centers. And, we are the world's first midlife wisdom school. And we've had people from 60 countries come to MEA to do our week-long workshops. We have 60 regional chapters around the world. So it's a bit of a movement. In some, we help people to learn how to navigate transitions and elevate their TQ, their transitional intelligence, which is an MEA trademarked word or term. We help them to cultivate their purpose, own their wisdom, and reframe their relationship with aging. And we've had people as young as 25 and as old as 91. We have a workshop. We have workshops year-round at both campuses. We have a workshop for exiting founders at our Santa Fe workshop. At the website's meawisdom.com. You can look at the workshops there. We also have online programs as well.
This is fantastic. There's a group of around 3,000 post-exit founders, and I think a big portion of them would raise their hand and want to do something like this. A few things that you say that resonated is I also had some friends that committed suicide that were entrepreneurs and going through their midlife. And this podcast, I've interviewed 50 people in the past year, and a lot of them are going through some pretty big things, but they can't talk to people about it, either for they feel like it's not a relatable concern. They feel like they don't feel comfortable speaking up. And so it really resonates as far as like the impact is very much there. Suicide rates in men, but also entrepreneurs is very high. It's up there with doctors. So those are the top two. So anything that we can do to counter that would be tremendous.
Agreed.
With the Modern Elder Academy, how do you see this progressing? You mentioned that there was chapters. Do you see this being more of like something where each city has a branch and meets on a regular basis? How do you see it progressing?
So one of our typical workshops has maybe 24 people in it. And so a workshop after a five-day workshop, that cohort will stay in touch. But then beyond that, a person may go home to Chicago or to Austin, and they want to be like connected to MEA people in their region. And those regional chapters have meetings, usually or events, parties, speakers once a month or so. And there's no cost to be part of that. And so it's a way for people to keep it going. Because there's an ethos, there's a sort of a way of looking at the world that people learn from being at MEA and the curriculum. Often people want to meet, people in their community who are similar. So I think the biggest thing is it's sort of a movement. The movement being, how do we help people to reframe their relationship, especially in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, but even in their 30s with, what does it mean to get older? And how do you make sure that the best years of your life are ahead of you? For a lot of people, that is news to them, that there's like anything like that out there. I wish this had been out there when I was in my late 40s, thinking about selling my business and feeling a bit lost and feeling sort of stupid. So, and it's not just for entrepreneurs and business people. It's sometimes people who are going through a divorce, going through, challenges with the kids or empty nest, issues of sandwich generation, taking care of parents and kids at the same time. People who have a cancer diagnosis, people who've sold a business or have gotten fired from a business and try to figure out what's next.
Chip, what are you curious about now for 2025? Like you're sitting down and you're looking at what's coming. What are you curious about?
Well, I'm most curious about my evolving role with my sons. I have sons who are in Houston who are 13 and 10, was a lesbian couple who asked me to be the sperm donor. They're friends, and originally I was just going to be like the transactional partner here, and like, here you go. But then they had 2 boys, and they wanted me to be in the boys' lives, and so my process of being, I've had a foster son in the past, but that was different than having biological sons. So how I have elevated myself in the company now to being executive chair and no longer CEO, which means I'm less involved in the day-to-day, so that I can have more time for my sons as they are going into their teen years. That's a curiosity I have, is like, I have been dad to them from the start, and they, consider me dad. But how do I make sure that I'm in Houston or they're in Baja or Santa Fe or San Francisco, which is another place we meet a lot, at least once a month where I'm being in that dad role. That's sort of a new role for me at 64 years old.
That's really exciting. And I also like seeing life through kids' eyes. Like you're getting to experience that with them again, That's
Exactly.
Chip, that's fantastic. Where should people go to find you?
You can find more about me at chipconley.com, but also at the meawisdom.com website. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, and I have a daily blog, which you can find on both of those websites. And the daily blog is called Wisdom Well. But I post on LinkedIn, each of my daily blog posts. So if this is interesting to people, feel free to look at LinkedIn for the daily blog as well.
That's fantastic. Chip, thank you so much for being on.
Oh yeah, Connor. Great to see you. Look forward to hanging out in person.
That sounds great, Chip. Cheers.
That wraps up today's episode. For more inspiring stories and valuable lessons from successful entrepreneurs, be sure to listen and subscribe wherever you get podcasts. Thanks for listening. Until next time, keep pushing boundaries and writing your next chapter.